"You've done enough for this family," my daughter-in-law said one quiet evening at our dinner table, and in that moment I realized something strange about my life. People only say that when they believe you are no longer needed. The words sounded polite, almost gentle, but they hung in the air like a closing door. My son Daniel sat across from me, turning his glass slowly in his hands, watching the ice melt in his iced tea. He didn't look angry. He didn't look cruel. He just looked comfortable. Comfortable with the idea that I had reached the end of my usefulness. I remember noticing the small things in that moment. The way the kitchen light reflected off the wooden table Robert and I bought 30 years ago in Columbus, the faint smell of roasted chicken still lingering in the room, the soft ticking of the clock above the stove. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary evening. Yet something inside me shifted quietly, like a lock turning after decades of being stuck. I didn't argue. I didn't ask what she meant. I simply nodded and said, "Maybe you're right." At 72, you learn that raising your voice rarely changes anything. Silence, on the other hand, has a way of revealing the truth. That night after they left, I stayed in the kitchen long after the dishes were clean. I sat with a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in my hands and stared out at the backyard where Daniel used to play baseball as a boy. I could almost see him there again, 8 years old, wearing that oversized red cap and swinging a plastic bat with all the determination in the world. Back then, I believed the most important job in my life was to give everything I had to my family. And I mean everything. Time, energy, dreams. I believed that if you loved people hard enough, if you sacrificed enough, if you worked long hours and kept the house warm and the table full, then one day you would look around and see that all that love had built something unbreakable. A family that would hold you the way you once held them. That was the promise I believed in when I married Robert at 24. I had dreams back then, the kind young women carry quietly in their hearts. I wanted to travel, maybe open a small bookstore one day, live in a house with big windows facing the morning sun. But life moves fast when you are busy taking care of everyone else. Robert worked long hours at the hardware supply company. Daniel came along 2 years later. Bills arrived like clockwork. Groceries, school supplies, car repairs. And every year I told myself the same thing. There will be time later. Later became the quiet agreement I made with my own life. I'll rest later. I'll pursue my dreams later. I'll think about myself later. And the strange thing about later is that it always feels far away until one day you wake up and realize it has quietly disappeared. Sitting there that evening, watching the last bit of sunlight fade over the fence line, I felt a thought settle into my mind with surprising clarity. There were things I understood now that I wished someone had told me 40 years ago. Not big dramatic warnings. Just simple truths about family, loyalty, and the dangerous habit of giving so much of yourself that one day people begin to believe your life exists only for them. I wasn't angry. Not at Daniel. Not even at Emily. If anything, I felt something closer to calm curiosity. Because for the first time in a very long time, I started asking a question I had never really asked before. What would I tell the young woman I used to be if she were sitting across from me at this same table? I slept very little that night after Daniel and Emily left. The house was quiet in the way only an old house can be, with small creaks in the walls and the low hum of the refrigerator filling the spaces where conversation used to live. Around 3 in the morning, I walked into the living room and turned on the lamp beside Robert's old reading chair. The same chair he used every evening for almost 30 years. The cushion still leaned slightly to the right because he always sat the same way, one arm resting on the wooden armrest while he read the newspaper. I sat there for a long time looking at that chair and thinking about the young woman I used to be. At 24, I believed adulthood was a straight road. Work hard, love your family, stay loyal, and everything would eventually balance itself out. That was the story my parents believed too. My father worked 40 years at a printing plant in Dayton. My mother kept a tidy home and never complained about the long days or the tight budgets. I watched them and thought that was how life worked. Responsibility first, dreams later. When Robert proposed to me, we were standing outside a small diner on High Street in Columbus after a late dinner. He did not kneel like people do in movies. He simply looked at me and said, "Helen, we could build something good together." And I believed him. I believed him so completely that I never once imagined asking what building that life might cost me. In those early years, everything felt hopeful. Our first apartment was barely 600 square feet, with thin walls and a kitchen so small you could reach the refrigerator from the stove without taking a step. But we were proud of it. I remember measuring the living room one afternoon with a yellow tape measure and telling Robert that someday we would have a house with a real dining table where our children could do homework while I cooked dinner. It sounded like a dream back then. 2 years later, Daniel was born on a cold February morning when the temperature outside dropped to 15 degrees. I remember holding him in the hospital room and feeling a strange mixture of joy and responsibility settle over me. Suddenly, every decision mattered more. Robert worked longer hours at the hardware supply company, and I took a bookkeeping job for a small insurance office 3 days a week. We were busy all the time, but in those days I believed busy meant progress. Every sacrifice felt temporary. I would stay late at the office now so that one day we could afford a better house. I would skip vacations now so that Daniel could attend a good school later. Life became a series of quiet trade-offs that always seemed reasonable in the moment. Over the years, the small apartment became a modest house in a quiet Ohio neighborhood. The kitchen window faced the backyard just the way I once imagined. Daniel played baseball out there almost every afternoon in the summer, his sneakers kicking up dust as he ran between imaginary bases. I would stand at the sink washing dishes and watch him through the glass, thinking that this was exactly the life I had hoped for. A stable home, a hardworking husband, a healthy child growing up under a safe roof. Yet looking back now, I realize something important about those years. While I was busy building a life for everyone else, I slowly stopped building one for myself. The dreams I once carried became polite little promises I kept postponing. The bookstore idea stayed in the back of my mind like a photograph tucked inside an old drawer. Travel plans became something we talked about during holidays, but never actually planned. None of it felt tragic at the time. It felt responsible. It felt like the right thing to do. And that is the strange part about choices that shape your entire life. They rarely arrive with warning signs. They come disguised as love, duty, and common sense. By the time you notice the pattern, decades have already passed quietly behind you. I remember the exact afternoon when the rhythm of our life began to change. Although at the time it seemed like nothing more than another ordinary Tuesday. Daniel was 16 years old and already taller than Robert. The two of them stood in the driveway arguing gently about how to fix the loose handle on the garage door while I watched from the kitchen window with a cup of coffee in my hands. The sun was bright, the grass in the backyard had just been cut, and the whole scene looked like the kind of moment people frame in family photo albums. Back then, I believed we had reached the comfortable middle of life, the stage where the hardest years were behind us and the future would simply unfold in a predictable line. Daniel would graduate high school, attend college somewhere within driving distance, maybe return to Ohio after a few years with a good job and a young family of his own. I imagined holiday dinners with grandchildren running through the living room while Robert complained about the football game on television. It felt so certain that I never questioned it. What I did not understand then was how quietly distance can grow inside a family. It does not arrive with loud arguments or dramatic moments. It begins with small shifts that are easy to excuse. Daniel started spending more time away from home during his senior year of high school. That was normal, I told myself. Teenagers build their own lives. After college, he moved to Cleveland for his first job with a marketing firm. Again, I told myself that was normal. Young people follow opportunities. Robert and I drove up to visit him on weekends sometimes, bringing homemade meals and extra blankets for the cold winters near Lake Erie. Daniel always seemed happy to see us, but our visits became shorter each year. There were always meetings he needed to attend or projects he needed to finish. Then one summer afternoon, he called to tell me he had met someone special. Her name was Emily. I remember sitting at the kitchen table holding the phone while he described her bright voice, her quick sense of humor, and the way she could organize an entire event in a single afternoon. I felt genuinely happy for him. Every parent hopes their child will find someone who makes their life brighter. When I met Emily for the first time a few months later at a small restaurant near the riverfront in Cleveland, she greeted me with a confident smile and a firm handshake. She was intelligent, polished, and very sure of herself. During dinner, she spoke easily about her career in corporate event planning and the long hours she often worked to keep clients satisfied. I remember noticing how quickly she answered questions, how smoothly she directed the conversation whenever it drifted toward uncomfortable topics. At the time, I interpreted that confidence as ambition. I told Robert during the drive home that night that Daniel had chosen a strong partner. Robert nodded and kept his eyes on the highway. After a few miles, he said something that seemed harmless then, but echoes in my memory now. He said, "Strong people often know exactly what they want." The truth was that Emily didn't know exactly what she wanted. She wanted efficiency, order, and a clear structure in everything around her. Within a year, Daniel and Emily were married in a tasteful ceremony at a hotel outside Cleveland. The reception hall was filled with soft lights and careful decorations that Emily had planned herself down to the smallest detail. Everyone complimented how elegant the evening felt. I remember standing beside Robert near the back of the room, watching Daniel laugh with his new wife as guests congratulated them. I felt proud and relieved. My son had built the beginning of his own family, just as I once had. Yet even that night, there were small moments that should have made me pause. When the photographer asked for a family portrait, Emily gently rearranged where everyone stood so that the picture looked balanced. I ended up slightly behind Daniel instead of beside him. It seemed like such a minor adjustment that I laughed and stepped where she pointed. The camera flashed, the guests applauded, and the evening continued. Looking back now, I realized that moment carried a quiet message I did not understand yet. Sometimes the smallest changes reveal who will eventually stand at the center of a family and who will slowly move toward the edges. I did not notice the pattern right away. Life rarely changes in dramatic ways. Instead, it moves quietly, like a tide rising inch by inch, until one day you realize the shoreline looks completely different. After Daniel and Emily returned from their honeymoon in California, they settled into a small, modern townhouse outside Cleveland. It was a clean, bright place with large windows and sleek furniture that Emily had chosen carefully. The first time Robert and I visited, she gave us a cheerful tour through every room, explaining how each piece of furniture had been selected to maximize space and efficiency. I admired her organization. Everything had its place. The kitchen counters were spotless, the shelves perfectly arranged. Even the living room pillows were aligned with precise corners. At the time, I believed that level of order simply meant she cared about her home. During dinner that evening, I offered to help wash the dishes, the same way my mother had always done when visiting family. Emily smiled politely and said she preferred to handle it herself because she had a specific system for cleaning and drying everything. I stepped back and thanked her, assuming she was just particular about her kitchen. Looking back now, I realized that small moment carried another quiet message. In Emily's world, there was already a structure forming, and everyone around her slowly learned their place inside it. Over the next few years, Robert and I continued our routine of occasional visits and holiday gatherings. Daniel's career progressed quickly. He moved from marketing assistant to project manager, then to senior coordinator at the firm. Emily's event planning business expanded as well. She traveled often, sometimes flying to Chicago or Atlanta for conferences and corporate celebrations. Whenever we spoke on the phone, she described her work with impressive energy, explaining how every detail mattered when organizing events for large companies. I listened carefully and encouraged her because I believed supporting family meant celebrating their ambitions. Meanwhile, Robert and I continued living in the same house we had purchased decades earlier in our quiet Ohio neighborhood. The maple tree in the backyard grew taller every year, its branches stretching over the fence line where Daniel once practiced baseball throws as a boy. Our routines remained simple. Morning coffee at the kitchen table, grocery shopping every Saturday afternoon, quiet evenings with television news and Robert's favorite mystery novels. It felt peaceful, steady, and familiar. Yet slowly our role in Daniel's life began to shift. At first, the changes were small enough to overlook. Holiday visits became shorter because Daniel and Emily needed to return home early for work commitments. Phone calls moved from long Sunday conversations to brief check-ins between meetings. Emily often suggested new traditions that fit better with their schedule. Instead of spending Thanksgiving in our dining room, we sometimes met at restaurants halfway between our cities. Instead of Christmas morning at our house, we occasionally exchanged gifts during quick weekend visits in December. None of these adjustments sounded unreasonable. In fact, they sounded practical. I told myself that families simply adapt as life becomes busier. What I did not realize then was how easily practical decisions can slowly reshape relationships. Every new arrangement placed Daniel and Emily closer to the center of the family structure, while Robert and I stepped a little farther toward the edges. Again, it was not done with cruelty or open conflict. It happened through polite suggestions, efficient planning, and the quiet assumption that younger lives always move faster than older ones. Robert noticed some of these changes earlier than I did. One evening, while we were washing dishes together, he looked at me thoughtfully and said something that stayed with me long after the water stopped running. He said, "Helen, when you organize your life around everyone else, people eventually assume that is exactly where you belong." I laughed gently and told him he was overthinking things. Families grow and change. That was simply how life worked. Robert nodded but did not argue further. Sometimes wisdom appears in small sentences that seem unnecessary at the time. Only years later do you understand how clearly someone else saw the direction your life was already moving. The evening air felt heavier than usual as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner for Robert and myself. The sun had already begun to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that had seen decades of family life unfold. I placed the roasted chicken into the oven, its aroma filling the house in a way that always made me feel grounded, connected to the life I had built. I paused and looked around, noticing small details I had taken for granted for years: the faded wallpaper in the hallway, the worn edges of the dining table, the framed photographs lining the living room shelves. Each picture held a memory, a chapter of our life together. Yet lately they seemed to speak to me in a language I was only beginning to understand. Daniel and Emily had called earlier to let us know they would be visiting the next weekend. Their voice warm, but carrying an underlying urgency that I could not quite place. I set the table with care, arranging the silverware just so, and poured water into the glasses, watching the ice cubes settle with tiny pops and cracks. I reflected on the way life had quietly shifted around me, how decisions made years ago had set a rhythm that now left me slightly out of step. Even the simplest interactions with Daniel and Emily carried a subtle tension, a careful balance between politeness and control that Emily maintained effortlessly. As I chopped vegetables for the salad, I thought about the lessons hidden in these small moments, lessons I had ignored when I was younger because they seemed ordinary, unremarkable. Every folded napkin, every perfectly aligned plate, every suggestion Emily made about how to organize the family calendar was a reminder of the careful precision with which she ran her world. I realized then that I had spent much of my adult life allowing myself to be a part of someone else's rhythm, adjusting my steps to match theirs, believing that harmony was more important than asserting my own space. And yet, as I stood there in the quiet kitchen, I also felt a spark of clarity. I understood that recognizing the patterns of influence, the subtle ways in which priorities were directed, was the first step toward reclaiming a sense of agency. I did not need to argue or confront, not yet. Observation alone carried power, a quiet understanding that allowed me to see how life had been structured and where my own desires had been quietly postponed. I set the salad on the counter and wiped my hands, feeling a strange mixture of anticipation and resolve. It was not the dramatic realization one might see in movies, but rather a measured, intimate awareness that change begins in small increments, in the way one arranges a meal, the way one holds a conversation, the way one notices the unspoken cues that define a household. That night, as Robert and I sat down to eat, I kept my thoughts to myself, listening more than speaking, noticing more than reacting. I paid attention to the subtle shifts in tone, the way Emily's instructions had filtered through Daniel's responses, and how our family routines had evolved. Each detail was a lesson, a thread in the larger tapestry of understanding that I was slowly weaving for myself. By the time the dishes were done and the kitchen quiet once more, I felt a sense of control returning, not as a loud proclamation, but as a steady, deliberate awareness that the choices I had made and those I would make from this moment forward mattered. And in that quiet evening, I began to outline in my mind the principles I wished I had known earlier, small truths about balance, respect, and the importance of observing before acting, which would serve as the foundation for the decisions I would take in the years ahead. The following morning, sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, casting a soft golden glow across the countertops and the worn wooden floor. I stood at the sink, running cold water over the remaining dishes from last night, my mind replaying the small lessons I had begun to notice over the past weeks. Every detail of our household routine, every conversation with Daniel or Emily, seemed to carry an unspoken message that I was only now starting to interpret. I realized that while I had spent years giving freely, observing politely, and keeping peace, there was an entirely different approach to living that I had never embraced, one that involved quietly asserting boundaries, maintaining personal agency, and acknowledging the power in knowing when to step back. As I wiped the dishes and placed them in the drying rack, I reflected on the ways my life could have been different if I had been more deliberate about the small choices that accumulate over decades. Simple things like keeping a separate bank account, insisting on making certain decisions for myself, or taking time for personal projects might have changed the dynamics without ever causing conflict. I thought about Emily, her efficiency, and the calm certainty she carried, and I understood that influence is often exercised through subtle consistency rather than loud declarations. It is in the repeated small actions that patterns of control form, unnoticed until they are firmly in place. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the small table by the window, looking out over the backyard where the maple tree's shadow stretched across the lawn. The quiet air allowed me to hear the faint creaking of the floorboards upstairs, a familiar reminder of all the years lived in this home, all the routines that had shaped the rhythm of our days. I allowed myself to sit with the awareness that observation alone can be a powerful form of preparation. Knowing how a situation has evolved is the first step toward making thoughtful, intentional changes. I began to list in my mind the areas where I could regain a sense of agency. The scheduling of visits, financial decisions, household responsibilities, and even the allocation of attention and care. Each of these small elements, when adjusted, could begin to shift the balance, quietly but decisively. I considered taking a walk around the neighborhood later in the day, feeling the sun on my face, and imagining a plan that would allow me to maintain dignity and influence in ways that did not require confrontation or drama. There was a clarity that came with sitting quietly, thinking through options, and noticing the subtle rhythms of family life. For decades I had followed the currents, and now I understood that I could also set the course. As I finished my coffee, I looked at the clock and noted the passing of time with calm precision. Each hour was an opportunity to reinforce the lessons I was internalizing, to act with intention, and to quietly establish boundaries that would honor both myself and my relationships. I realized that life does not always announce its lessons in dramatic ways. Often they appear through the accumulation of small, consistent observations. Sitting there in the warmth of the morning light, I felt a quiet determination take root, a sense that the coming days could be guided by the awareness I had been cultivating. Change does not have to be abrupt or confrontational to be effective. It can be gentle, consistent, and grounded in a deep understanding of what one values and what one will no longer allow to be overlooked. That morning, I made a silent promise to myself to continue watching, learning, and preparing to act with calm intention so that the choices I made in the days ahead would be aligned with the life I wanted to lead. I decided to take a quiet walk around the neighborhood that afternoon, letting the crisp autumn air fill my lungs and the sun warm my shoulders. The streets were familiar, lined with maple and oak trees whose leaves had begun to turn shades of gold and red. Each step allowed me to think more clearly, to organize the lessons I had been accumulating without confrontation or argument. I passed by neighbors I had known for years, exchanging gentle nods and smiles, acknowledging the life around me without needing to explain anything. I noticed how small habits can define the rhythm of a community, just as they had defined the rhythm of my own household. Observing these patterns reminded me that control is often subtle, existing in the way one schedules a day, arranges a room, or responds to requests. Returning home, I spent the evening reviewing the stack of notes I had been keeping over the past weeks. Simple observations, ideas for personal boundaries, and reflections on the dynamics with Daniel and Emily. I wrote about the importance of maintaining a personal space, of ensuring that one's contributions are recognized but not taken for granted, and of establishing small, consistent practices that assert one's own priorities without causing conflict. I reflected on the years I had spent organizing holidays, preparing family meals, and coordinating events, all while quietly setting aside my own preferences and projects. Each memory carried a lesson, now clearer than ever. I realized that respect is rarely demanded and often silently withheld until demonstrated through consistent action. By the time Robert returned from his evening walk, I had outlined practical steps to balance support for my family with the assertion of my own needs. We shared a simple dinner, speaking minimally, but the conversation carried an undertone of shared understanding, a recognition that life could be adjusted without tension or confrontation. After cleaning up, I retreated to the living room, placing myself in Robert's reading chair, and opened a notebook to continue writing down reflections that would eventually become a guide for the choices I planned to make. Each sentence I wrote reinforced the quiet determination that had been growing over the past weeks. I did not need to announce this to anyone. Change could begin with observation, reflection, and carefully considered action. The house was silent except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic on the nearby street. I allowed myself to sit with the weight of decades of habit, sacrifice, and attention to others, and I acknowledged the possibility of a life that included consideration for my own desires as well. The evening moved slowly, each passing moment offering clarity, as I began to imagine the practical steps to reclaim space within my family dynamic, to contribute without losing myself, and to ensure that my presence was appreciated in the ways that truly mattered. By the time I set the notebook aside and extinguished the lamp, a sense of purpose had settled over me. Not loud or dramatic, but firm and deliberate, built on the awareness that subtle, consistent actions often carry more power than overt confrontation, and that a life observed carefully can be a life gently redirected toward fulfillment. I woke early the next morning, the first light of day spilling through the blinds and casting long stripes across the kitchen floor. I made my way to the counter, placing a kettle on the stove and arranging a cup for myself. Steam rose slowly as I poured hot water, and I sat at the small wooden table near the window, watching the neighborhood come alive with morning activity. Cars rolled down the street, neighbors walked their dogs, and the faint sound of a lawnmower echoed from a nearby yard. I allowed my thoughts to drift back over the weeks of observation and reflection, thinking carefully about the adjustments I wanted to make in the way I interacted with Daniel and Emily. Each realization I had noted over the past days seemed clearer in the quiet light of morning. I understood that my presence in their lives could be balanced in a way that supported the family without allowing my own contributions to be overlooked or taken for granted. I began making a plan, simple yet deliberate, outlining the boundaries I would set regarding visits, household involvement, and the way I allocated my time. It was not a list for confrontation or drama, but a structure that ensured respect for both their independence and mine. I wrote down notes about maintaining personal projects, keeping certain finances separate, and preserving small rituals that were meaningful to me, such as morning coffee at the table and walks through the neighborhood. Each step was a reminder that careful consistency carries power, and that subtle actions often yield greater change than direct confrontation. I reflected on past holidays, the way I had coordinated meals, decorations, and travel arrangements, and I saw how small shifts in timing and planning could subtly influence family dynamics. I imagined approaching future interactions with a calm awareness, observing without reacting impulsively, speaking with purpose, and choosing when to contribute my energy. The day moved forward with quiet intention. I carried out chores with deliberate thought, keeping my attention on the small details of daily life, noting patterns and responses, and envisioning how I could navigate them in ways that reinforced both my dignity and my sense of agency. The sunlight shifted across the kitchen and dining room as I worked, and I felt a steady calmness growing within me, a clarity about how I would proceed. I thought about the small but meaningful interactions I could create, the gentle guidance I could offer, and the quiet consistency that would allow my voice and presence to be acknowledged without demanding it forcefully. Each action I considered was rooted in observation, understanding, and foresight. By mid-afternoon, I had outlined a practical plan for the coming weeks, a series of steps to maintain presence and influence in the family, while ensuring that my own needs and wishes were not overshadowed. I set the notebook aside, feeling a sense of readiness and calm, confident that the choices I made could be enacted gracefully, without confrontation, and with the awareness that subtle, consistent decisions can quietly reshape relationships. The air grew cooler as evening approached, and I stepped onto the back porch to breathe in the crispness, watching leaves drift slowly from the maple tree onto the lawn. Each leaf seemed a small reminder that change is natural, inevitable, and best approached with patience, observation, and careful thought. I felt a deep sense of preparation, an understanding that life could now be guided intentionally, and that by acting thoughtfully in small, consistent ways, I could shape the days ahead with quiet confidence and a renewed sense of agency. I sat quietly in my favorite chair by the window, the early morning light reflecting softly on the pages of the notebook I had been filling for weeks. Each line I wrote contained observations, reflections, and lessons drawn from decades of living, careful attention to the subtle patterns of my family, and the quiet evolution of our relationships. I thought about the young Helen I once was, full of energy and hope, and the choices I had made, some deliberate, some unconsidered, that shaped the life I had led. The warmth of the sunlight contrasted with the coolness of the air coming through the slightly open window, and I felt a clarity that had been absent for many years. I reviewed the principles I had outlined, maintained personal boundaries, observed before acting, prioritized my own dignity, and recognized the value of small, consistent actions over dramatic gestures. I thought about Daniel and Emily, how their lives had developed around a structure that they understood and controlled, often without realizing how my quiet acquiescence had allowed it to take shape. I imagined sitting down with my younger self and offering simple but essential advice. Cherish your independence, protect your space, value your contributions, and never allow your presence to be taken for granted. I pictured explaining that life is a series of small choices, each with cumulative power, and that understanding these choices early can prevent years of unintended compromise. I considered the mornings spent at the kitchen table, the dinners prepared, and the holidays carefully orchestrated, all as acts of love and duty, and recognized how they also shaped expectations that were not always communicated. The recognition of this duality, love and responsibility intertwined with oversight and assumption, was profound. I thought about the quiet moments of observation, the gentle awareness of patterns in conversations and actions, and how these moments had provided the groundwork for understanding influence and agency. I reflected on the freedom that comes from being deliberate about decisions, even in small matters, and the quiet empowerment of knowing when to step back, when to participate, and when to assert oneself with calm precision. As I wrote, I visualized delivering this advice to my younger self, not as a lecture, but as a series of gentle, firm insights that could guide her through life with greater awareness and balance. The realization that wisdom is often earned in silence and observation settled in me. I understood that life does not demand drama to teach its most important lessons. It provides them in measured, consistent increments that require attention and reflection to grasp fully. I closed the notebook slowly, feeling a sense of completeness and calm. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting a warm glow across the room and illuminating the familiar surroundings that had witnessed so many years of love, sacrifice, and learning. Sitting there, I felt prepared to approach each coming day with intention, clarity, and the quiet confidence that comes from understanding the patterns of life, the value of thoughtful action, and the importance of carrying oneself with dignity, awareness, and grace in every interaction and choice.